When I ran my thumb over the worn leather of her Bible, a folded slip of paper fell onto the dusty floorboards. It felt as though the very rotation of the earth had ceased just for a moment. If he finds out about the boy, he will destroy us all. 9 words that took the man I thought I was, a grieving widower lost in memories, and forged him into the man I needed to become. Good afternoon, my friends. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 82 years old, and today I'm going to share a story with you that I have held locked in my heart for more than 50 years. But before I begin, if you're finding your way to my little channel for the first time, please consider clicking that subscribe button and maybe leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. It helps an old man feel a little less alone and allows me to keep sharing these chapters from my life. It was the autumn of 1972, and I was just 31 years old. The world was a tumultuous place, with headlines screaming about conflicts and politics. But in our small corner of New England, life moved to a quieter rhythm, dictated by the turning of the leaves and the first frost on the pumpkins. I had been married for 12 years to Eleanor, a woman who was, by all accounts, the sun around which my world orbited. She was a brilliant accountant at a prestigious local manufacturing firm, a woman of sharp intellect and quiet grace, considered by all who knew her to be a paragon of diligence and integrity. Our home was a modest but sturdy clapboard house on a street lined with ancient oak trees, with a small garden out back where Eleanor grew the most beautiful roses you have ever seen. We had a son, Daniel, a bright and curious boy of 10 who had inherited his mother's mind and, I like to believe, my artistic soul. I was, for lack of a better term, the dreamer of the family. A musician who made a meager living teaching guitar lessons and playing in smoky bars on weekends. I provided the art, the music, the laughter. Eleanor provided the structure, the stability, the reality. I was what you might have called the perfect husband back then, at least in my own mind. I wrote her songs. I made sure the house was filled with music when she came home from a long day. I helped Daniel with his school projects. Eleanor handled the finances, the serious decisions, the quiet burdens that I, in my youthful self-absorption, never even saw. She was the steady hand on the tiller of our lives. Our marriage seemed, to anyone looking in, a perfect harmony. Eleanor was supportive of my artistic pursuits. She brought gifts home from her business trips, and our home was always filled with warmth and love. But looking back now, through the clarifying lens of time and truth, I can see the silent spaces, the conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room, the shadows in her eyes that I dismissed as weariness from her demanding job. She traveled often for the firm, usually on the last weekend of the month. Audits and consultations, she would explain with a vague wave of her hand. I never questioned it. Why would I? Doubting Eleanor would have been like doubting the sunrise. Once, when I pressed for details about a trip to a city I knew she disliked, she simply smiled a tired smile and said, "Some things are just part of the job, my love. You focus on your beautiful music. Let me worry about the numbers." On that cold November afternoon, 6 months after we had buried her, my life was irrevocably altered. Daniel was at a friend's house for the weekend. The house was deathly quiet, a silence that seemed to amplify my grief. I had finally gathered the strength to go through her personal belongings, a task I had been dreading for months. The pain was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest. Her closet still smelled of her perfume, a faint scent of lavender and old books. It was in her bedside table, beneath a stack of worn poetry books, that I found her old family Bible. It was a beautiful thing, bound in dark leather, its pages thin as whispers. I had never seen her read it, but she kept it close, a memento from her grandmother. As I lifted it, the book fell open, and from between the pages of Ecclesiastes, the small, folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor. My first instinct was to ignore it, to close the book and put it away. The past was a painful country I was not yet ready to explore. But something compelled me to bend down and retrieve it. With hands that trembled, I unfolded the note. The handwriting was Eleanor's, elegant and precise, even in its apparent haste. "If he finds out about the boy, he will destroy us all." The blood in my veins turned to ice. The suffocating grief was suddenly replaced by a sharp, cold shock. My legs felt weak, and I had to sit heavily on the edge of the bed. Who was he? And more terrifyingly, who was the boy? Daniel was her only child. 1,000 questions detonated in my mind, each one more painful than the last. Carefully, I folded the note and placed it back exactly where I had found it, between the same brittle pages. I closed the Bible and returned it to the drawer. My mind was a maelstrom. When Daniel returned home the next day, I had made a decision. I could not confront this mystery head-on. If this note meant what I feared, a direct approach could shatter the pristine memory of the woman I loved and the life we had built. Instead, I would pretend that nothing had changed, while I, the dreamer, the artist, would learn to become a detective in the landscape of my own past. That evening, I helped Daniel with his homework, just as I always had. I listened to him talk about his weekend. I laughed at his jokes. On the outside, I was the same grieving father. But on the inside, a fundamental part of me had been fractured. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception. I maintained our routine meticulously. Breakfast at 7, Daniel off to school, hours spent in my music room, pretending to compose. But my focus was elsewhere. I began to pay attention to the details I had ignored for years. I started to look through old photo albums, searching her face for clues, for a hint of the fear that must have lived behind her calm smile. I noticed the way she had organized her files, the meticulous records of household expenses, but the complete absence of any personal financial documents. Small omissions that had once seemed like quirks now screamed of secrets. A week after finding the note, I made my first concrete discovery. I was cleaning out the old roll-top desk in the study, a piece of furniture she had used for her personal affairs, when I found a hidden compartment. It was a simple trick panel at the back of a deep drawer. Inside was a small, locked metal box. The key was not on her keychain, nor in any of the usual places. It took me 2 days of relentless, quiet searching before I found it, taped to the underside of the top shelf in her closet, a place I would never have looked. My heart pounded as I turned the small key. Inside the box was not evidence of an affair, but something far more confusing. There were bank passbooks from a bank in a neighboring state showing regular, substantial monthly deposits for the past 5 years. The total amount was staggering, nearly 4 times what I made in a year. And alongside them, a single, professionally taken photograph of a young boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with sandy blonde hair and eyes the exact shade of Eleanor's. He was a stranger to me. I felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath me. Eleanor, my practical, frugal Eleanor, had a secret bank account with a small fortune in it. And who was this child? In the same box, I found a small, worn address book. Most of the entries were familiar, friends and family. But one name was written on the last page, circled in red ink. Marcus Thorne, with an address in Richmond. The name meant nothing to me. My heart ached with a pain deeper than grief. It was the pain of betrayal. But my resolve only hardened. I began to invent reasons to visit the state where the secret bank was located. I needed rare guitar strings. I wanted to visit a college friend. I had a lead on a potential gig. With each trip, I tried to learn more about the mysterious account. It was on my second visit that I succeeded. I found a branch, a small, discreet institution. Posing as a widower, trying to settle his late wife's estate, I managed to speak with a kind, elderly bank manager who remembered Eleanor. "Oh, Mrs. Vance, yes. Such a lovely woman," the manager recalled. "So dedicated. She came in every month like clockwork. Said the account was a trust for her nephew. A poor boy," she said, "lost his parents in an accident. She was his sole benefactor, a nephew." Eleanor had no siblings. Each word was another piece of a puzzle I couldn't comprehend. I returned home that day with my mind reeling, but with a growing certainty. My marriage, my entire understanding of my life with Eleanor, was built on a foundation of secrets, and I needed to understand what Marcus Thorne had to do with it all. In the following days, I continued my silent inquisition. I reached out to a cousin who worked as a private investigator, a man I hadn't spoken to in years. Through carefully worded, hypothetical questions during a long phone call, I learned how to search public records without raising red flags. We're all so busy with this big merger, A friend who still worked at Eleanor's firm commented innocently during a chance meeting at the grocery store. Your Eleanor was the key to the whole thing. Mr. Thorne relied on her completely. I've never seen so much paperwork, so much money changing hands, the big merger he mentioned. And, curiously, it was finalized just months before Eleanor's sudden illness. The pieces began to connect, forming a terrifying picture. Marcus Thorne was not just a name in an address book. He was the powerful CEO of her company. The note, the secret account, the photograph of the boy, the nephew story, they were all part of a plan. A plan to protect someone. But from what? And from whom? That's when I remembered a strange incident from years before. A locked briefcase she always carried on her business trips. At the time, when I had jokingly asked what was inside State Secrets, she had given me a sharp, cold look and said it was just confidential work files, then quickly changed the subject. Now, that briefcase took on a new significance. I waited until Daniel was at school, and I began to search for it. It wasn't in her closet, nor in the attic with the old luggage. Finally, I found it hidden in the back of the linen closet, tucked away behind stacks of old quilts. It was locked. It took me an hour with a small screwdriver and a lot of patience to pry the lock open. Inside, I found more evidence of her secret. Legal documents, birth certificates, and a bundle of letters. The letters were from a woman I'd never heard of, detailing a life of fear and hiding. And then I found it. A birth certificate for a boy named Peter, born 8 years ago. The mother's name was listed as Sarah. The father's name was Marcus Thorne. The last letter was the most recent, dated just 2 weeks before Eleanor fell ill. My dearest Eleanor, only a few more months until we are free. I prepared everything as we planned. Peter asks about you constantly. I cannot wait to start our new life away from this suffocating fear and that man who will never stop hunting us. Be careful with the final details of the plan. As you always say, if he finds out about the boy before we're ready, he will destroy us all. But I know everything will work out. Soon we'll be the family we were always meant to be. With all my love, Sarah. Tears streamed down my face as I read. 12 years of marriage, a son we both adored, thousands of breakfasts shared, nights spent talking about our dreams. All of it was real, but it was all layered over a secret so profound it shook the foundations of my world. Eleanor hadn't betrayed me with another man. She had been protecting another woman, another child, from the powerful man she worked for. At that moment, sitting on the floor of the hallway with the evidence of her courage and her fear in my hands, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would not let her sacrifice be in vain. I would not let her fear be realized. I would use everything I had discovered to protect the people she had died protecting. Carefully, I put everything back in the briefcase, wedging the broken lock shut. I returned it to its hiding place. Nothing would reveal that I had discovered the truth. Now I had a name, Sarah, and a crime to unravel. And while preparing dinner that night, helping Daniel with his math homework as if nothing had changed, I already knew what I needed to do. Looking back today, I see how that simple act of going through her belongings was a blessing in disguise. If I hadn't opened that Bible, if that note hadn't fallen to the floor, their story would have had a very different and likely tragic ending. And you, my friends, have you ever had a moment in your life where a small accident uncovered a profound truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I truly love to read your stories. After discovering the contents of the hidden briefcase, I spent the entire night sleepless. Daniel slept soundly in his room, blissfully unaware that the world he knew was built on a secret scaffolding he could never have imagined. And I, sitting in the dark living room, saw the streetlights cast long shadows across the floor while I pieced together the puzzle of Eleanor's hidden life. I had the what, but I lacked the who and the why. Who was Sarah? And why did Marcus Thorne, a man of immense wealth and power, pose such a threat to his own son? I had to act, and act carefully. My first step was to secure my own position. I couldn't rely on the small income from my music. I needed resources. Luckily, Eleanor had been meticulous. All our joint accounts were in perfect order. But the secret account, the one in the neighboring state, was my priority. I needed to ensure that money was safe, that could be used for its intended purpose, protecting Peter. The next morning, I began to execute my plan. First, I needed to know my enemy. I spent days at the local library, poring over old newspapers and business journals, building a profile of Marcus Thorne. He was a pillar of the community, a celebrated philanthropist, a man who projected an image of unimpeachable integrity. He was also a widower, his wife having died in a tragic car accident nearly a decade ago. He had no other known children. This public persona was so flawless, so carefully constructed, that it made the threat in the notes seem even more menacing. Men who build such perfect facades often have the darkest cellars. The second step was to find Sarah and Peter. The letters in the briefcase had no return address, and the envelopes were gone. They were a dead end. The only clue I had was the address from Marcus Thorne himself, noted in Eleanor's address book. It was a long shot, a dangerous one, but it was all I had. I couldn't just show up at his door. I needed a reason, a pretext. That's when I remembered Eleanor mentioning a charity art auction Thorne hosted every year at his estate. It was a major social event. I was a local artist, a musician. Perhaps I could offer to perform for free. It was a flimsy excuse, but it might just get me onto the property, give me a chance to observe, to listen. I made up a story about Eleanor having always wanted to contribute to his chosen charity. I wrote a letter to Thorne's foundation, offering my services as a classical guitarist for the evening. To my surprise, I received a polite, affirmative response a week later. The third step of my plan was the most perilous, finding someone on the inside. It couldn't be just anyone from her old firm. Thorne's influence was pervasive. The local police chief was on the board of his foundation. The mayor was a personal friend. Then I remembered Clara, Eleanor's former assistant, a quiet woman who had retired a year before Eleanor's death. Anthony always complained about her, calling her nosy and overly meticulous. She was exactly the kind of person I needed. I found her number and called her, inventing a story about needing help sorting through some of Eleanor's complex financial paperwork for the estate. She agreed to meet me at a quiet coffee shop downtown. I carefully prepared an envelope with copies of the bank passbooks and a redacted version of one of Sarah's letters, one that hinted at fear without revealing the full story. How to deliver it without raising her suspicions? I decided on a direct but cautious approach. "Clara, I know this will sound strange," I began after we had exchanged pleasantries. "But I believe Eleanor was involved in something complex, something that might have put her under a great deal of stress before she passed. She was helping someone, I think. Someone in trouble." I watched her face carefully. She was a master of neutrality, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, recognition. "Mr. Thorne is a demanding man," she said evasively. "The merger was a stressful time for everyone." I pushed a little further. She mentioned a special project, a trust she was managing. For a nephew, Clara's composure finally broke. A small, sharp intake of breath. She looked around the coffee shop nervously. "Mr. Vance," she whispered, leaning forward, "some things are better left alone. For your own safety. For your son's safety." Her fear was confirmation enough. I slid the envelope across the table. "I'm not looking for trouble, Clara. I'm looking for the truth. Eleanor was my wife. I need to understand." She took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll look at this, but I make no promises. And you must never, ever mention my name." The fourth step was to prepare for the future. If I succeeded, Thorne would be exposed. But what would become of Sarah and Peter? And what dangers would I be bringing to my own doorstep? I reconnected with my cousin, the private investigator, telling him a slightly altered version of the truth, that I was helping a friend uncover a case of corporate blackmail. "This is out of your league, Art," he warned. "These men play for keeps," but he gave me advice, contacts, names of lawyers who weren't afraid of powerful people. Meanwhile, I continued my life as a grieving father. I took Daniel to the park, I taught my guitar students, I wrote melancholic melodies in my study. At night, when the house was quiet, I planned. I studied the layout of Thorne's estate from aerial photos I found at the county records office. I practiced what I would say, how I would act at the auction. The week before the event, I received a discreet call from Clara. "The deposits matched the dates of Mr. Thorne's business trips," she said, her voice barely audible. "The ones Eleanor always had to prepare the confidential paperwork for. And there's more. Thorne's late wife. The accident wasn't as straightforward as the papers reported. There were whispers, rumors of another woman. Sarah, a chill ran down my spine. The pieces were locking into place, forming a picture of monstrous proportions. Gertrude, she said suddenly, her voice laced with fear. I think we need to reschedule our next meeting. You know, something is off. He's been asking questions about old files. I understood immediately. The meeting was a code. Thorne suspected something. The danger was no longer abstract. It was imminent. After putting Daniel to bed that night, I found Eleanor's briefcase again. I took out the letters, the birth certificate, the photograph of the boy. I made high-quality copies of everything at a 24-hour print shop in the next town. I placed the originals in a safety deposit box at a different bank, and I hid the copies in a new, more secure location. On the day of the auction, a crisp autumn Saturday, I dressed in the only decent suit I owned. I'll be home late tonight, I told Daniel, kissing his forehead. A special concert. Any problems at all, you call your uncle, you understand? He nodded, too engrossed in his book to notice the tremor in my hand. Before leaving, I did something I rarely did. I went to my music room and took out my oldest guitar, the one my father had given me. I played a simple, quiet melody, one of Eleanor's favorites. It was a prayer, a promise, and a farewell to the simple man I had been. After I left, I prepared for any outcome. I left a sealed envelope with my cousin, containing a letter explaining everything, copies of the key documents, and instructions to open it if he didn't hear from me in 24 hours. The day dragged on. I practiced my music, my hands feeling clumsy and foreign. Normal activities of a common musician. While inside, I was a storm of fear and resolve. In the afternoon, Clara called from payphone. He's bringing in auditors, a new team. On Monday, she whispered frantically. He's going to purge the old records. Whatever you're going to do, it has to be tonight. I thanked her for the information with a steady voice I didn't recognize as my own. When she hung up, I sat in my quiet house, the silence pressing in. It was happening. My plan, born of grief and a cryptic note, was in motion. But what would come next? I drove to the Thorne estate as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson. The house, usually a distant shape on a hill, was now a blaze of light, an opulent fortress. And I was about to walk right into the lion's den. The Thorne estate was even more intimidating up close. A long, winding driveway led to a grand mansion that seemed to be carved from moonlight and money. I parked my old, sputtering car among a fleet of luxury vehicles, feeling like a sparrow that had wandered into an eagle's nest. I was checked at the door by polite but firm security guards, and once inside, I was hit by a wave of noise and expensive perfume. The Great Hall was filled with the city's elite, men in tailored tuxedos and women in glittering gowns, all laughing and sipping champagne. I felt a profound sense of dislocation. Just a few weeks ago, my biggest concern had been composing a new song. Now, I was in the heart of my enemy's territory, on a mission to uncover a truth that could get me killed. I was escorted to a small alcove where I was to perform. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the main hall. I searched the crowd for Marcus Thorne. It didn't take long to spot him. He was exactly as he appeared in the newspapers. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a charismatic smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a king in his court. My plan had several parts. The first was to find Sarah. I had the small photograph of her son, Peter, in my pocket. It was a desperate hope, but perhaps she was here. Perhaps Thorne kept her close, a beautiful prisoner in his gilded cage. While the guests mingled, I began my performance, my fingers moving automatically over the fretboard. The music was a shield, allowing me to observe without drawing attention to myself. I scanned every face, searching for a woman who might match the faint, grainy image of the mother in my imagination. But there was no one. The women here were polished, confident, and carefree. Nothing like the frightened author of those desperate letters. My second objective was to find Thorne's private study. Clara had told me it was on the second floor, west wing, and that he kept his most sensitive documents there. It was a long shot, but if I could find a way to get in, I might find the original, untraceable records of his payments, the proof of his control over Eleanor and Sarah. The opportunity came during the live auction. As the guest's attention was focused on the frantic bidding for a modern art piece, I slipped away from my alcove. I moved through the less crowded hallways, my heart pounding with every step. The West Wing was quieter, the sounds of the party muffled by thick carpets and heavy doors. I found the study easily enough. The door was solid oak, and it was locked. My cousin had given me a small set of lockpicks, and I had spent hours practicing on old locks at home, but my trembling hands betrayed me. The pick slipped, making a faint scratching noise. I froze, listening. Nothing. I tried again, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. The lock clicked open. The room was dark and opulent, lined with books that looked like they had never been read. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space. The air was thick with the smell of leather and cigar smoke. I didn't have much time. I moved quickly to the desk, trying the drawers. They were all locked. I didn't have the skill or the time to pick these complex locks. I scanned the room for a safe, a hidden panel, anything. Behind a large, ornate painting of a ship in a storm, I found it, a wall safe. It was useless without the combination. Despair began to set in. My plan was failing. I had risked everything to get here, and I was going to leave with nothing. As I turned to leave, my hand brushed against a silver picture frame on the desk. It held a photograph of Thorne with his late wife, and next to it, a smaller, simpler frame, turned slightly away from view. My breath caught in my throat. I picked it up. It was a photo of the boy, Peter. He looked a few years older than in the picture I carried, but it was unmistakably him. Thorne kept a photo of his son he was hiding on his desk. What did it mean? As I placed the frame back down, my fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible switch on its base. A faint click echoed in the silent room. I looked around wildly. A section of the bookshelf next to the desk had swung inward, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a single, thick leather-bound ledger. I opened it. It was filled with pages of handwritten notes and numbers, columns of dates and figures next to initials. I quickly found them. E. V. Eleanor Vance. And S. R. Sarah. I didn't know her last name, but it had to be her. The numbers were staggering, a meticulous record of blackmail, of money funneled through shell corporations, of a scheme so vast and complex it made my head spin. This was it. This was the proof. I couldn't take the ledger. It would be missed immediately. I had a small spy camera with me, a gift from my PI cousin. With shaking hands, I photographed every single page, the tiny click of the shutter sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hall. My blood ran cold. I shoved the ledger back, closed the secret panel, and fumbled with the painting, trying to get it straight. The doorknob began to turn. There was nowhere to hide. I flattened myself against the wall behind the heavy velvet curtains just as the door swung open. It was Marcus Thorne. He strode into the room, not even glancing in my direction, and went straight to the bar cart to pour himself a drink. He seemed agitated, muttering to himself. He took a long swallow of his drink and then walked over to the desk. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was certain he would notice the slightly askew painting, the faint scratch on the door lock. He picked up the photo of Peter, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then he sighed, a sound of profound weariness, and placed it back down. He took another drink and walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my body rigid, my lungs burning. When I was sure he was gone, I slipped out from behind the curtain and crept out of the study, my legs feeling like jelly. I made my way back to the party, which was now in full swing. No one had even noticed I was gone. I picked up my guitar and began to play, my mind a whirlwind. I had the proof. But what came next was even more dangerous. As I was packing up my instrument at the end of the night, a woman approached me. She was older, elegant, with kind eyes. "Your music was lovely," she said. "My name is Judge Alastair. I was a great admirer of your wife's work. She was a brilliant woman, a woman of great integrity." I thanked her, my throat tight. "She spoke of you, you know," the judge continued, her voice lower now. She once told me that your music was the one thing in her life that was completely pure and true. If you ever find yourself needing to fight for something true, Mr. Vance, I hope you'll remember me. She handed me her card and then melted back into the crowd. I stood there, stunned. Was it a simple compliment or a message? Had Eleanor confided in her? That night, I drove home under a starless sky, the roll of film in my pocket feeling heavier than a bar of gold. My plan had worked. I had survived the lion's den, but the war was just beginning. The days following the auction were a blur of nervous energy and meticulous planning. I had the film developed at a specialty shop an hour away, the grainy black and white photos of the ledger confirming the horrifying extent of Thorne's criminal enterprise. It was a web of blackmail, fraud, and money laundering, with Eleanor and Sarah tangled in the very center. The ledger was the key, but it was not enough. I needed context, I needed a witness, I needed to find Sarah. Judge Alastair's card felt like a lifeline in my pocket. Eleanor had trusted her, and that was enough for me. I called her office and, to my surprise, was granted a meeting the very next day. I sat in her chambers, a small, book-lined room that smelled of old paper and justice, and I told her everything. I started with the note in the Bible, the secret bank account, the briefcase, and finally the ledger I had photographed in Thorne's study. I laid the photos out on her polished desk. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable, her fingers steepled under her chin. When I finished, the silence in the room was deafening. I suspected something was wrong, she said at last, her voice heavy. Eleanor came to me about a year before she passed. She didn't give me details. She was too afraid, too protective. She spoke in hypotheticals, asking questions about witness protection, about creating new identities. She was trying to find a way out, for herself and for someone else. The judge looked at me, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. Your wife was one of the bravest people I have ever met, Mr. Vance. She was caught in an impossible situation. Marcus Thorne is a dangerous man, with connections that run deep. A direct assault through the police would be a mistake. He would bury the evidence, and he would bury you. My heart sank. So what do? We need to find the woman, Sarah, Judge Alastair said, her voice now firm and strategic. Her testimony is the one thing Thorne can't control. Do you have any idea where she might be? I thought of the letters, their tone of loving desperation. There was no address, but there was a clue I had overlooked. In the last letter, Sarah mentioned Peter asking about Eleanor. It implied a connection, a relationship. Eleanor had been sending money to the secret account every month on the last weekend. The same weekend she was supposedly on business trips. It wasn't a business trip. She was visiting them. I remembered the name of the bank in the neighboring state. It was in a small, sleepy town called Havenwood. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. The judge agreed. Go, she said. Find her. I will start making discreet inquiries here. I will find a prosecutor we can trust, someone from outside Thorne's sphere of influence. But we won't move until you have her, and she is willing to talk. The next morning, I packed a small bag, told Daniel I was going to a music retreat for a few days, and left him in the care of my brother. The drive to Havenwood was 3 hours of tense silence. It was a picturesque little town, the kind you see on postcards, with a quaint main street and white picket fences. It seemed an unlikely place to hide from a powerful monster. I checked into a small motel and started my search. I began at the school, armed with the photo of Peter. I made up a story about being an old family friend trying to reconnect. The school secretary was polite but firm. She couldn't give out any information. I tried the local library, the town hall, the post office. Nothing. No one named Sarah or Peter with the last name Ross. It had been a desperate guess based on the initials in the ledger. After 2 days of hitting brick walls, I was losing hope. I was sitting in a small diner, staring into a cold cup of coffee, when I overheard 2 women in the booth behind me talking about the upcoming town fair. Is Sarah helping with the bake sale again this year? One of them asked. Of course, the other replied. Her lemon meringue pie is the main attraction. Ever since she and the boy moved here a few years back, she's thrown herself into every community event. My head snapped up. It was a common name, but the timeline fit. Excuse me, I said, turning around. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm looking for a friend named Sarah. She has a young son, Peter. The women exchanged a look. You mean Sarah Martin? One of them said. She lives in the little blue cottage at the end of Elm Street. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel in my throat. I thanked them, paid for my coffee, and drove to Elm Street. The blue cottage was small but well kept, with a garden full of late-blooming flowers. I saw a child's bicycle leaning against the porch. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to figure out what to say. How do you approach a woman who has been living in fear and tell her you know her secret? Finally, I got out of the car and walked to the front door. I knocked. A moment later, the door opened, and there she was. She was younger than I expected, with tired eyes that held a deep-seated fear. She was holding the hand of a small boy with sandy blonde hair and Eleanor's eyes. Can I help you? She asked, her voice wary. My name is Arthur Vance, I said softly. I was Eleanor's husband. The color drained from her face. She quickly pushed the boy behind her, her body tensing as if preparing for a blow. I don't know who you're talking about, she whispered, trying to close the door. Please, I said, holding on my hands. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help. Eleanor was trying to help you. I found a note. I know about Thorn. Her eyes filled with tears, and her composure crumbled. She pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. Over the next few hours, in her small, sunlit living room, Sarah told me the whole story. She had been Thorn's personal assistant. They had a secret affair. When she got pregnant, he was ecstatic, promising to leave his wife, a woman he claimed to be cruel and unstable. But it was all a lie. His wife found out, and shortly after, she died in that convenient car accident. Sarah was terrified. She realized Thorn had no intention of marrying her. He wanted the heir, but not the scandal of the mother. He isolated her, controlled her every move. Eleanor, Thorn's most trusted senior accountant, discovered discrepancies in the accounts, small amounts of money being funneled away. She confronted Thorn, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, he had confessed everything, not out of remorse, but as a threat. He implicated her in the fraud, making her an unwilling accomplice. He used her expertise to hide his money, and he used her as his go-between with Sarah, delivering supplies and cash. But Eleanor did more than that. She secretly set up the trust account. She devised the escape plan. She was going to use her knowledge of his crimes to force him to let Sarah and Peter go, creating new identities for them abroad. She was my angel, Sarah wept. She was going to save us. When I heard she had died, I thought our lives were over. I showed her the photos of the ledger. She identified the initials, confirmed the dates, explained the purpose of the payments. It was all there. She had the final piece of the puzzle. I can't testify, she said, her voice trembling with fear. He'll kill me. He'll take my son. He won't, I said, my voice filled with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. We have him. We have a judge, a prosecutor. We have the proof. But we need you. Eleanor gave her life to protect you. Don't let that be for nothing. I stayed in Havenwood for another 2 days, talking with Sarah, earning her trust, playing with Peter, a wonderful, bright little boy who was so much like my own Daniel. Slowly, her fear gave way to a fragile hope. On the 3rd day, she agreed. For Eleanor, she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. And for my son, I called Judge Alastair. I have her, I said. It's time. We arranged for a state trooper, a man the judge trusted implicitly, to pick them up and place them in protective custody. I watched the unmarked car drive away, carrying the woman and child my wife had died to save, and I felt a profound sense of peace. The first part of my promise was fulfilled. Now for the second. Now for justice. Returning home after securing Sarah and Peter felt like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The ordinary world seemed strange, muted. My own house, my music room, Daniel's cheerful chatter. It all felt like a life that belonged to someone else. The man who had left a few days ago was not the same man who returned. The dreamer had been replaced by a man with a mission. Judge Alastair moved with surprising speed. The prosecutor she had chosen, a sharp and fearless woman named Maria Fuentes, met with me and Sarah separately. I walked her through my discovery, from the note in the Bible to the photographs of the ledger. Sarah safe in a secure location, gave a detailed, tearful deposition, corroborating everything and providing the first-hand narrative of Thorne's abuse and control. The trap was set. The plan was not to arrest Thorne immediately. Fuentes knew he would use his wealth and influence to Stonewall to destroy evidence. Instead, they decided to use his own arrogance against him. They would build an ironclad, secret indictment, and they would strike when he least expected it. My role in this phase was the most difficult of all. I had to do nothing. I had to return to my life, pretend that my trip had been nothing more than a music retreat, and wait. The waiting was excruciating. Every day, I expected a black car to pull up outside my house. Every phone call made my heart leap into my throat. I watched Daniel sleep at night, and the weight of the danger I had invited into our lives felt crushing. I found solace in my music, but the melodies I wrote were no longer just melancholic. They were infused with a tension, a sense of impending resolution. 3 weeks after my trip to Havenwood, it happened. I was at the grocery store when I saw the headline on a local newspaper. Philanthropist Marcus Thorne indicted on fraud, extortion charges. I felt a dizzying wave of relief. They had done it. They had moved on him at his office, a swift and sudden operation that had caught him completely off guard. The news sent shockwaves through our community. The man who had been a local hero was revealed to be a monster. The story that unfolded in the press was one of greed and manipulation. My name, and Sarah's, was kept out of the initial reports to protect us. The case was built on a mountain of financial evidence, presented by a special prosecutor. Stemming from an anonymous tip, Thorne's carefully constructed world came crashing down. His powerful friends distanced themselves. His business partners panicked. He was arrogant to the end, denying everything, claiming he was the victim of a corporate conspiracy. The trial was a quiet affair, moved to a different county to ensure an impartial jury. I attended every day, sitting at the back of the courtroom, a silent observer. I watched as Maria Fuentes systematically dismantled Thorne's defense, presenting the damning evidence from the ledger, backed by expert financial testimony. The key moment came when the prosecution presented evidence of the secret shell corporations and offshore accounts. It was the information from Eleanor's files, the complex web she had been forced to maintain, that became his undoing. She had left a trail, a series of cryptographic clues in the accounting notes that only someone with her level of genius could create, and only someone with a ledger as a key could decipher. It was her final, brilliant checkmate from beyond the grave. Thorne never saw it coming. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He never showed a flicker of remorse. It was only then that I finally understood the full meaning of the note in the Bible. If he finds out about the boy, he will destroy us all. It wasn't just a fear of physical harm. Thorne was on the verge of moving his illicit fortune overseas, and he was planning on taking Peter with him, creating a new life as a single father with his miracle son. He would have her raise Sarah, and he would have used his power to destroy anyone who stood in his way, including my wife, whose knowledge of his finances made her the biggest threat of all. Her sudden illness, I now believe, was no accident. The doctors had called it a rare, aggressive infection. I now suspect it was something far more sinister, a quiet, untraceable poison. I had no proof, but in my heart, I knew I had not just uncovered a fraud. I had avenged a murder. In the aftermath, life slowly found a new normal. A court-appointed administrator took over Thorne's company and assets. A significant portion was placed in a trust for Peter, exactly as Eleanor had intended. Sarah, now free, decided not to return to Havenwood. With her new resources, she moved to the West Coast to start fresh, giving Peter the safe and happy childhood he deserved. We stayed in touch, exchanging letters and phone calls. Two strangers bonded forever by the love and sacrifice of one incredible woman. The children, Daniel and Peter, half-brothers by blood, began a tentative relationship through letters and later, visits. It was what Eleanor would have wanted. As for me, the quiet musician, I found that my life had been irrevocably changed. The experience had unearthed a strength in me I never knew I possessed. I became more engaged, more present in my own life and in my son's. I established a small music scholarship in Eleanor's name at the local community center, a tribute to the woman who had believed in the power of art and the necessity of integrity. That night, after the verdict came in, I returned home and went to Eleanor's bedside table. I took out her Bible and opened it to the book of Ecclesiastes. The small, folded piece of paper was still there. I took it out, walked to the fireplace, and watched as the flames consumed the 9 words that had turned my world upside down. They were no longer needed. The threat was gone. The promise was kept. My wife, my brave, brilliant Eleanor, could finally rest in peace. The years that followed the trial were a time of quiet rebuilding. Our lives, which had been thrown into chaos by the revelation of Thorne's crimes, slowly settled into a new, more honest rhythm. Michael, my son, who was only 10 when the storm broke, grew into a fine young man. The ordeal had forced him to mature beyond his years, but it had not broken his spirit. He had his mother's sharp mind, and I was proud to see her unshakable sense of justice. He excelled in school, eventually becoming a lawyer, a champion for those who couldn't fight for themselves. I have no doubt that the silent legacy of his mother's courage guided his path. Sarah and her son, Peter, thrived in their new life. Free from a shadow of fear, Peter grew up to be a well-adjusted, happy young man, aware of his mother's strength and the sacrifice of the woman who had saved them. He and Michael built a real relationship over the years, a bond that transcended the dark circumstances of their connection. They were brothers, and seeing them together, so different yet so clearly family, was a source of profound joy for me. My life, too, found a new purpose. I continued to teach and play music, but I was no longer just a dreamer lost in his melodies. I had learned the hard way that the world required more than just beauty. It required vigilance, courage, and a willingness to act. I became more involved in my community, serving on the board of the library, volunteering for local charities. I used the quiet respect my actions had earned me not for personal gain, but to try and make our small corner of the world a little safer, a little kinder. I never remarried. Eleanor was the great love of my life, and my journey after her death was not about replacing her, but about honoring her. My quest to understand the note she left behind had led me on a journey to understand her, and in doing so, I had finally found myself. I learned that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens and fight the bravest battles. Eleanor had been a warrior disguised as an accountant, a hero hidden in plain sight. Her legacy was not in the money she had saved or the crime she had exposed, but in the lives she had protected and the man she had forced me to become. Years later, after Thorne had died in prison and the story had faded from the headlines into local legend, I met Judge Alastair for lunch. She had long since retired, a formidable woman with sharp eyes that still missed nothing. "I often think about your wife," she said, stirring her tea. "In my line of work, you see the worst of humanity. It can make you cynical, but then you encounter someone like Eleanor Vance, and it restores your faith." She faced down a truly evil man, armed with nothing but her intellect and her conscience. I was a fool. I confessed a guilt I still carried. I lived with her for 12 years, and I never saw her struggle. I never knew. The judge reached across the table and patted my hand. "Don't say that, Arthur," she said gently. "You weren't a fool. You were the person she was protecting. Her love for you and Michael was her sanctuary. It was the one part of her life that Thorne couldn't touch. By being the dreamer, the musician, you gave her a place of peace to return to. That was not a small thing. Her words were a gift, a release from a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. She was right. Our home, our life, my music, it had been her refuge. And in the end, it was the love forged in that refuge that gave me the strength to finish her fight. My boutique, Atelier Gertrude. Yes, I ended up partially giving in to Marianne's modern suggestion, flourished beyond our most optimistic expectations. From 1973 to 1975, we went from a small space on Madison Avenue to an elegant store with a wide storefront on Park Avenue, a noble area of the capital. What began as a custom sewing studio transformed into a reference of fashion for special occasions. I remember the pride I felt when in 1975, one of my wedding dresses was photographed for a women's magazine. Gertrude, the woman who 5 years before faced the scandal of being the thief's wife, now saw my creation stamped on glossy pages with the caption, "Elegance," signed by Gertrude. Marianne revealed herself to be not only an excellent administrator, but also a visionary for business. It was her idea to expand to a small line of ready-to-wear dresses, more accessible than custom-made, but maintaining the quality that characterized us. We created the young Gertrude line, inspired by Teresa's drawings, already a teenager with evident artistic talent. Our unusual partnership, the betrayed wife and the ex-mistress, became a discreet subject in the city's social circles. Some people turned up their noses, finding the arrangement scandalous. Others admired our ability to overcome the past for the sake of the children and the future. Most, fortunately, were too busy with their own dramas to care about ours. The children grew up healthy, each with their distinct personality. Michael, at 14 years old, was a serious and studious teenager, fascinated by engineering and sciences. Teresa, at 12, already showed the artistic temperament that would mark her life, always with a sketchbook under her arm. And Charles, at 5 years old, was a happy and sociable child, adored by everyone at the studio. Our unconventional family now lived in a spacious house in the Georgetown neighborhood with a garden where the children could play and a studio in the back where I created my models when I needed silence. We had 2 maids who helped us with the house and children, a luxury unthinkable a few years before. Life finally seemed stabilized, like a boat that finds calm waters after a violent storm. Until one afternoon in June 1976, the past came to visit us again. I was at the studio adjusting a graduation dress for a client when our receptionist entered hesitantly. "Mrs. Miller, there's a man wanting to speak with you. He says he's Mr. Anthony Miller." The pen I was holding slipped between my fingers, slightly pricking my skin. Anthony. After 7 years in prison, he was free, a fact I knew would eventually happen, but for which I never felt completely prepared. "Tell him I'm busy," I replied automatically, a reflex of self-preservation. But then, looking at my client in the mirror, a young 18-year-old about to graduate, her whole life ahead of her, I thought about the woman I had become. I was no longer that insecure wife, intimidated by the mere presence of my husband. I was a businesswoman, a mother, a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ashes. "No," asked him to wait in the reception room. "I'll finish in 15 minutes. I completed the adjustment with hands that refused to tremble. I scheduled the final fitting of the dress and took a deep breath before walking to reception. Anthony was sitting rigidly in one of the elegant armchairs, looking out of place in that feminine and sophisticated environment. The years in prison had aged his face, completely whitened his once black hair. He wore a simple suit, clean but out of fashion, probably bought before his imprisonment. Our gazes met, and for an instant I was transported back to that kitchen in 1969, preparing breakfast for a man who planned to abandon me. Or worse. "Gertrude," he said, standing up. "Anthony," I replied with a calmness that surprised myself. "Let's talk in my office." I guided him through the studio, aware of the curious glances from the seamstresses and assistants. Many of them knew my story, or at least parts of it. Seeing the infamous ex-husband was like witnessing a legend character come to life. My office was a space that reflected who I had become. Organized, elegant, without ostentation, with Teresa's drawings framed on the walls and a large table where I could both design models and review contracts. "You've built something impressive here," he commented, observing the environment. "What do you want, Anthony?" I asked directly, indicating he should sit while I took my place behind the desk. The power dynamic between us was clearly different now. "To see my children," he replied, looking at a photo frame on my desk that showed Michael and Teresa at their middle school graduation. "I was released a week ago. I'm living in a boarding house near here. Michael is 15 years old now. Teresa, 13. They're no longer the children you left behind." "I know," he said, rubbing his hands nervously. "I received the letters and photos you sent. Thank you for that, for maintaining that connection, even after everything." I nodded silently. Despite everything, I had always kept my promise to keep the children connected to their father. I sent photos, school reports, important news, allowed them to visit him when they showed interest. Although these visits had become increasingly rare over the years. I also want to see Charles, he added, surprising me. Charles, you rejected your own son. Marian, show me your letter. A blush of shame hid his aged face. I was desperate, Gertrude. I thought it would be easier for everyone if I simply disappeared from your lives. But in prison, I had too much time to think, to regret. I studied his face, looking for signs of the old Anthony, the manipulator, the charming liar who had deceived not just me, but an entire town. I found only a worn, middle-aged man carrying the weight of his choices. I can't decide for Marianne about Charles, I finally replied. As for Michael and Teresa, they're almost adults now. The choice to see you or not should be theirs. That's fair, he agreed. Are you with someone now? The question caught me off guard with its irrelevance. What did my personal life matter to him? My private life is none of your business, Anthony. It hasn't been since the day I found that note. He lowered his head, accepting the reprimand. I understand. I just wanted to know if you managed to be happy despite what I did. I'm happy despite you. Not because of you, I replied, realizing the profound truth in those words. I built a life I love with people I value. The note that should have destroyed me ended up freeing me. When he left, I promised to inform the children about his return and let them decide if they wanted to meet him. I watched from the window as he walked down the sidewalk, shoulders slumped, a man diminished by his own choices. That night, I gathered Michael, Teresa, and Marianne in the living room. Charles was already asleep, oblivious to the emotional storm forming. Your father has been released, I announced without beating around the bush. He came to the studio today. Wants to see you, Michael. Almost a man now, crossed his arms defensively. In recent years, his visits to his father had practically ceased, replaced by an almost obsessive dedication to his studies. I have nothing to say to him, he declared with the firmness of young people who believe they have all the answers. Teresa, always more emotional, bit her lip, her eyes welling up. Did he ask about me specifically? He asked about both of you, I replied softly. The decision is yours. I won't force you to do anything. Marianne remained silent, but I noticed how her hands clenched nervously. The mere mention of Anthony still affected her despite the years and the new life she had built. He wants to see Charles, too, I added, looking directly at her. Her eyes widened. After the letter he sent me, after abandoning us? Why now? He says he repented, that he had time to think in prison. A heavy silence fell over the room, each absorbed in their own thoughts and memories. I'll meet him, Teresa finally decided. Not for him, but for me. I need to understand some things. Michael shook his head. I'm not ready yet. Maybe I never will be. Marian took a deep breath, eyes fixed on a photograph of Charles on the wall. If he really wants to know his son, I can't deny that to Charles, but it will be on my terms with clear boundaries. In the days that followed, our home, normally a refuge of hard-won peace, became an emotional minefield. Teresa met her father at a cafe near home. A 2-hour conversation that left her exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if she had finally released questions kept for years. He cried when I showed him my drawings. She told me afterward, he said he always knew I would be an artist. It's strange, Mom, but I don't feel angry anymore. Just a kind of sadness for what could have been. Michael maintained his decision not to see his father, channeling any emotional conflict into his studies and science projects. At 15 years old, he already spoke with conviction about studying engineering at the best university in the country. The most tense meeting was between Marianne, Charles, and Anthony held in a public park at her insistence. I didn't participate, of course, but Marianne told me afterward. While we had tea on the porch, she described how Charles, not knowing who that gentleman was, animatedly showed him his favorite toy car. Anthony kept repeating how he looks like Michael at the same age, she reported, her voice trembling. He asked forgiveness, said he wrote that letter in a moment of desperation. Offered money for Charles's education. Did you accept? I asked, knowing her fierce independence. No, she replied firmly. I said we didn't need his charity, that you and I built something solid, that Charles has everything he needs, but I agreed he can see the boy occasionally if Charles shows interest. In the following weeks, Anthony became a peripheral presence in our lives. He would appear on Sundays to take Teresa to lunch or Charles to the zoo. Michael remained steadfast in his refusal, although I suspected he secretly followed the stories Teresa told about these meetings. As for me, I maintained a polite distance. There was no more anger or fear, just the clarity that our paths had definitely separated 7 years before when I found that note in the Bible. Life continued its course. Our boutique continued to prosper, expanding to a second store in a newly inaugurated shopping mall, a new concept at the time. In 1978, I was invited to present a small collection in the first version of what would become the New York Fashion Week decades later. Michael graduated with honors from high school and was accepted to MIT. Realizing his dream of studying engineering, Teresa, following her artistic talent, entered the Rhode Island School of Design, eventually specializing in fashion design to work by my side. Charles, growing up in an environment surrounded by creativity and entrepreneurship, showed talents for business even as a child. Anthony found work as an accountant in a small company, living modestly in a rented apartment. The luxurious life he had known before prison was definitely in the past. At important events for the children, graduations, presentations, competitions, we maintained a cordial distance, silently recognizing that despite everything, we were united by the 3 young people we helped raise. It was in 1980, almost 11 years after the discovery of the fateful note, that the cycle finally completed. I was in my studio working on the final details of a wedding dress when my assistant interrupted me. "Mrs. Miller, there's a couple here wanting to speak specifically with you about an exclusive wedding dress." I adjusted my hair, now with some gray strands that I wore with pride, and went to the reception room. There, holding hands, were Edward, the former bank manager, author of the note, and a woman approximately his age, with a shy smile. Edward, I greeted him surprised. I hadn't seen him since his visit years ago. Shortly after leaving prison, "Mrs. Miller," he replied, visibly nervous. "This is Helena, my fiancée. We're getting married next month." A simple ceremony. When we were looking for someone to make her dress, your name appeared in all the recommendations. I didn't know if I would be welcome, but Helena squeezed his hand encouragingly. He told me about his past, about his connection with Mrs. Miller. She explained, "I know it's asking a lot, but I would be honored if you would consider creating my dress." I looked at that man who once had written the words, "If she discovers the truth, kill her," and his fiancée who accepted him despite his dark past. The irony of the situation didn't escape me. The man who had participated in a plan that almost destroyed my life now came to me seeking help to celebrate his love. 11 years ago, I would have refused immediately, moved by hurt and justified resentments. But the woman I was now understood something about second chances, about new beginnings, about transforming tragedies into triumphs. "Come with me, Helena," I said, guiding her to the fitting studio. "Let's talk about what you imagine for your big day." In the months and years that followed, our story continued to unfold in directions I could never have predicted. That fateful afternoon in 1969, Michael graduated as an engineer and eventually opened his own construction company. Teresa became my creative partner at the studio, bringing fresh air to my traditional creations. Charles, with support from both Marianne and Anthony, went into business administration, eventually taking over the management of the business that Marianne and I built. Marianne and I never separated, neither as partners nor as family. That temporary situation transformed into a lifelong partnership based on mutual respect, deep understanding, and a shared love for the 3 children we raised together. Many didn't understand our dynamic, but we learned to ignore external judgments a long time ago. Anthony passed away in 1995 after a sudden heart attack. At the funeral, we were all there. Michael, Teresa, Charles, me, Marianne, not for lost romantic love, but out of respect for the man who, despite his enormous mistakes, had connected us in ways none of us could have imagined. Today, at 78 years old, I look back and see how a simple note hidden in a Bible completely altered the course of my existence. What should have been my death sentence became, ironically, the catalyst for a full and authentic life. I now have 6 wonderful grandchildren. The boutique transformed into a nationally respected brand, although I officially retired a few years ago, leaving the business in the capable hands of Teresa and Charles. Marianne and I still live together. 2 elderly ladies who shared so much that they became practically sisters. Sometimes when we're gathered for a Sunday lunch, my children, grandchildren, Marianne, I think about that frightened 29-year-old woman, trembling as she read a threatening note with no idea how she would face the future. I wish I could go back in time and whisper in her ear, "Courage, Gertrude. What seems like the end of everything is just the beginning of something extraordinary. The storm is brutal, but what you'll build after it will be stronger and more beautiful than you ever imagined." Man, that's what I'd like to leave with you today, my dears. Whatever storm you're facing, know that it can be the beginning of something new, not the end of everything. Sometimes we need something to break completely so we can build something much more beautiful in its place. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey of memories. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, share it with someone who needs to hear a message of hope, and subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel for more stories of overcoming. Tell me in the comments if a great difficulty ever transformed into a blessing in your life. A loving hug from this grandma who learned that it's not the events that define our lives, but how we choose to respond to them. Until the next.